Tonight, the State of Israel is simultaneously absorbing the largest coordinated military assault in its history across four distinct operational fronts, whose combined threat volume has stretched the defensive architecture that Israeli security planning spent decades constructing beyond every threshold whose breach the planners had classified as manageable. What unfolded from the hours before dawn through the morning is not a crisis in the conventional sense that Israeli security institutions have managed across 7 decades of regional conflict. It is the operational realization of the scenario that Israeli strategic planning had always identified as the existential threshold. The simultaneous activation of every front by adversaries whose coordination had previously been assessed as insufficient to produce a genuinely synchronized multi-front assault at the scale the engagement has delivered. 28,000 rockets, fired across four fronts whose geographic distribution stretches the defensive coverage of Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the arrow systems from the Lebanese border in the north to the Red Sea approaches in the south, from the Gaza perimeter in the west to the Syrian frontier in the east. The volume is not the product of a single actor's inventory. It is the combined operational output of four distinct armed formations, each with its own chain of command, its own weapons inventory, its own target set, and its own operational logic, activated in a coordination window whose compression reflects a level of joint planning that Western intelligence assessments had consistently underrated. The specific shock inside the Israeli defense establishment is not that any single front has been activated at an operationally significant scale. Each of the four fronts has been active at various points across recent years, and the Israeli military has developed the operational experience, the doctrine, and the institutional procedures for managing each of them individually. The shock is that all four are active simultaneously at volumes that individually would strain the defensive architecture, and that collectively have produced the overstretching whose operational consequences the morning assessment is still attempting to quantify. A defensive system designed to manage threats from multiple fronts sequentially, with the ability to redistribute interceptor inventory and command attention between fronts as the operational tempo of each evolves, has encountered a threat environment in which the operational tempo of all four fronts has been generated simultaneously at volumes that do not permit the redistribution the doctrine requires. The Lebanese front, activated by Hezbollah, generated the largest single-front contribution to the 28,000 total. The Hezbollah rocket and missile inventory, accumulated across nearly 2 decades of sustained Iranian supply, through the corridors whose interdiction has been a consistent Israeli military objective, includes not only the short-range, unguided rockets that constitute the bulk of the volume, but the precision-guided missile variants whose accuracy against specific military and infrastructure targets requires the more capable Israeli interceptors that consume the inventory of the systems covering the northern theater at rates the unguided volume alone would not demand. The Northern Front has historically been the scenario Israeli planning treated as the most demanding single-front contingency. Last night it became one of four simultaneous demands on a defensive system whose total interceptor inventory had been sized against a threat model that did not incorporate this specific combination. The Gaza Front, activated by Hamas and the armed formations operating within the enclave, generated a rocket volume whose density against the southern communities, the industrial zone of the Negev periphery, and the logistics infrastructure connecting the south to the national supply network, has forced Iron Dome batteries in the southern sector into the sustained engagement rates that deplete their Tamir interceptor inventories at speeds that the resupply cycle cannot match under the operational conditions the engagement has created. The Gaza front volume does not carry the strategic weight of the Lebanese front on a per-missile basis. It carries its weight through the sheer, sustained density of engagement it demands for the defensive systems covering the southern sector, systems that cannot be redistributed to assist the northern, eastern, or southern Red Sea fronts, because their withdrawal from the Gaza coverage area would leave the southern communities without defensive coverage entirely. The Syrian front generated the component of the 28,000 whose approach geometry is most operationally problematic for the Israeli defensive architecture. Rockets and missiles fired from Syrian territory arrive from an azimuth that forces the Israeli defensive systems covering the eastern approaches to engage threats whose flight profiles differ from the profiles the same systems are simultaneously managing from the Lebanese north and the Gaza west. A defensive system managing simultaneous incoming threats from three different azimuths is not operating within the single-axis engagement geometry its intercept solutions were optimized around. The computational and engagement management load of simultaneously processing threat tracks arriving from north, west, and east, while maintaining the coverage discipline that prevents any single approach axis from becoming an undefended corridor, has pushed the command and control infrastructure of the Israeli air defense network into the operational regime whose demands the system designers had classified as the outer boundary of manageable complexity. The Yemeni front, the southernmost and in some assessments the most strategically revealing component of the forefront activation, generated ballistic missile and drone volume directed against the Eilat corridor and the Red Sea approaches, whose strategic significance for Israeli economic connectivity extends well beyond the immediate military consequences of the individual impacts. Eilat is not simply a southern city. It is the terminal point of the Red Sea maritime corridor, through which a substantial fraction of Israeli trade flows in the periods when Suez Canal access is operationally available. Disrupting the Eilat approaches simultaneously with the activation of the three northern fronts is not a tactical decision. It is a strategic one, designed to ensure that the economic pressure of the forefront assault extends beyond the immediate military consequences of the rocket volumes, to encompass the trade disruption whose duration will outlast the acute phase of the engagement. The coordination that produced this simultaneous forefront activation represents the operational achievement whose execution required the most sustained planning investment. 4 armed formations operating across 4 countries, each with its own command structure, its own operational priorities, and its own relationship with the Iranian strategic direction that has provided the supply, the training, and in varying degrees the operational guidance that the coordinated activation required, have generated a synchronized military action whose compression into a single operational window is the product of planning whose depth Western intelligence assessment had not adequately credited. The specific coordination challenge is not generating the volume. Each formation has been accumulating its inventory across years of sustained supply. The challenge is activating 4 inventories simultaneously, in a manner that prevents the Israeli military from sequencing its defensive response to address each front in turn, and the forefront activation has achieved precisely that prevention. Iranian strategic direction behind the forefront coordination does not require that Iran fire a single missile directly. The weapons are in the inventories of the 4 formations that fired them. The supply that filled those inventories reflects years of Iranian logistical investment. The operational guidance that informed the timing and the volume allocation across 4 fronts reflects the strategic calculation of an institution that has been building toward exactly this operational scenario for longer than any Western assessment had credited. Iran's direct military contribution to the 28,000 is the decades of investment that made the 28,000 possible, and the operational discipline of maintaining its own direct military posture in reserve, while the forefront activation consumes Israeli defensive capacity, is the signature of a strategic approach whose sophistication the engagement has validated at the highest operational level. The Iron Dome network, the primary defensive instrument against the bulk of the 28,000 rockets, has performed at the intercept rates its technical specifications promised, across the sectors where its battery coverage has been maintained. The problem is not Iron Dome's intercept performance. The problem is the relationship between the total TAMR interceptor inventory across the full national network, the simultaneous consumption rate that 4 active fronts at this combined volume imposes on that inventory, and the resupply timeline that the industrial capacity of the TAMR production infrastructure can sustain under operational conditions. TAMR interceptors are not infinitely available. They are manufactured at a specific production rate, stored at a specific inventory depth, and consumed at the rate that the incoming rocket volume demands. Against 28,000 rockets arriving across 4 fronts, the consumption rate has exceeded the production and resupply rate at the sector level in ways that are creating the coverage gaps the engagement is designed to exploit. The Israeli military's operational response to the forefront activation has been managed by a command structure that is simultaneously directing air operations against the launch infrastructure of all 4 fronts, managing the ground force deployments that the northern and eastern frontier situations require, coordinating the naval assets whose tasking has been affected by the southern Red Sea threat environment, and sustaining the command communications connectivity between the national level and the theater commands that the simultaneous demands of four fronts have stressed in ways that a single front engagement at any of the individual volumes would not have produced. The staff capacity required to effectively manage four simultaneous fronts at this combined scale is not the staff capacity that Israeli military planning had sized its command infrastructure around, because the planning assumption had always been that simultaneous four-front activation at this volume represented the outer boundary of the credible threat envelope, rather than an operational reality to be managed in real time. The Allied capitals that have been monitoring the engagement since its opening hours are processing the four-front activation through their own strategic frameworks, and the processing is producing assessments whose conclusions are visible in the diplomatic traffic even before formal positions have been announced. Washington is managing the simultaneous requirements of providing the political and military support that the American-Israeli relationship demands, while assessing the implications of a four-front engagement at this scale for the regional military balance and the American force posture whose forward presence the engagement has operationally contextualized. The Gulf capitals, whose normalization trajectory had incorporated assumptions about Israeli military resilience, are conducting the reassessments that any fundamental challenge to those assumptions requires. The European governments, whose Eastern Mediterranean security arrangements depend on stability assumptions the engagement has complicated, are assessing what the four-front activation means for the framework within which they had been managing their regional relationships. The fires burning across the communities, the military installations, and the infrastructure struck by 28,000 rockets across four fronts are the visible expression of an operational achievement whose strategic significance extends beyond the physical damage the individual impacts have produced. 28,000 rockets did not overwhelm the Israeli defensive architecture through any single failure. They overwhelmed it through the simultaneous imposition of demands across four fronts, whose combined volume exceeded the total defensive capacity that Israeli planning had determined was sufficient against the threat environment it had modeled. The threat model was wrong about the coordination, wrong about the simultaneity, wrong about the volume that four fronts activated together could generate, and the wrongness has produced the operational reality the morning assessment is now documenting. The four fronts are still active. The rocket volumes have not returned to zero. The defensive systems are managing the continuing demands with whatever interceptor inventory and whatever command capacity the opening hours of the engagement have left available. In a theater where 28,000 rockets fired across four simultaneous fronts can overstretch the most comprehensive defensive architecture any regional state has ever constructed, what does security actually require? What does the promise of technological defense actually mean when the threat has been structured specifically to exceed the capacity within which that promise operates? Iran has provided its answer through decades of supply, training, and strategic coordination that produced the forefront activation and validated it in a single operational period. The rest of the region is still calculating the cost of that answer, and the calculation will determine the shape of the regional order that emerges from the smoke rising across four fronts this morning.